Sometimes I find the grid gets in the way, and there's this little checkbox, or not a checkbox, but an icon up here that says grid, and I'll just click that and I can turn it off. All right, so when we create an object, we create it in object mode, essentially. We don't have access to the components. To access the components, we use the right mouse marking menu. So before, where we were using the shift right mouse button marking menu, to get the components of an object, we use the right mouse. And at the top here, you can see, among other things, vertex, edge, face, and object mode. And those are the most important ones. Sometimes you'll accidentally go into something like vertex face, and you'll be, what did I do? And you don't know how to, get out of it. If you're in a component mode, you can just right click and go back to object mode, and then you're in object mode. So if I go over to the left here to vertex, this is what vertices look like in Maya. They're purple, and there's a pre-selection highlighting little red thing over it, which is useful because you know what's going to be selected before you click on it. And when you click on it, they turn yellow. And selecting vertices is pretty much exactly the same as selecting objects. You can marquee select them. You can shift select to toggle your selection or add to them. Command shift to, Control shift rather. Again, see, I get confused between the Mac and the Windows hotkeys, but Control Shift will add to your selection regardless of what's there. This is just a bit of a refresher from last time. And Control will subtract from your selection. It's the same as with objects. If you're going into the Move tool, I'm hitting W there, you'll see that the pivot point for the components comes in as the average of the components that are selected, which kind of makes sense, and that's pretty useful. You select all of these top ones, and the pivot for the Move tool is there. We can move vertices, rotate them, scale them. Same thing as what we would do with primitives. And same as with primitives, we can change the pivot point. So if we wanted, for example, to hold down D and click on one of these vertices and release D, then when we scale, you can see that the scaling happens with respect to that pivot point. But if we deselect everything and select the same ones, the pivot point gets reset. So that's how component pivot points work. Okay, so now I'm going to jump into edge mode. So right mouse and going up to edge. And now we're in edge mode. And again, we've got the red sort of pre-selection highlighting. Again, selection is pretty much the same, although there is one thing that is particularly useful with edges that I will show you right off the bat. We're going to be talking about topology in a future class, but if I click on an edge, then I get the edge selected. But if I double click on an edge, it'll select the entire edge loop. And that's very useful. So I'm double clicking on an edge and it goes all the way around. And that's very useful for scaling and manipulating and doing other things. If I double clicked on one of these side edges, again, we're going to be talking about topology and why this happens a little later on. But basically, it goes as far as possible in either direction before it runs into a vertex where it doesn't know which direction to go past that. So we've got this whole corner selected. Double clicking on this one, we've got this whole sort of edge along the corner selected. I'll explain what I did there in a moment. But the other thing that double clicking on edges does is it selects continuous border edges. So I've deleted a face. Again, I'll talk about deleting faces and stuff in a minute. But if I double click on the edge here, instead of looping around like it did before, it's going to select the continuous border edges. And that's useful for other reasons. So that's a couple of points on selecting edges. I'm going to undo to get the face back. Okay, so right mouse down to face, and we're in face mode. And again, selecting faces is very much like selecting any other components. If you marquee select over a portion of a face, it will be selected. So you don't have to select the whole face in order to select a face, even if you just get a little piece of it. And then I could control deselect a face, and then I've got all these ones. And so you can also just drag out a very narrow marquee, and you'll get all of the edges or the faces in a loop there. And then I can right click and go back to object mode, and I'm back in object mode. So those are the components and selecting faces and edges and vertices. Deleting components is worth a brief discussion because it's a little bit different for vertices, edges, and faces. With faces, you just select a face and hit delete. Very simple. Select a face and hit delete. And that's useful for a variety of things. And that is the appropriate way to do it. With edges, however, I'm going to undo. With edges, however, deleting them is a little bit different. If I double click to select this edge loop, I've got those edges selected. I could hit delete on the keyboard, and I will do that, but that's created a problem. And the problem it's created is that it's left behind stray vertices. If I go into vertex mode, you can see them, they're left behind. And as a result of that, we've created a bunch of n-gons, and that's not ideal. So instead, what we want to do is we want to use the delete edge command. And here I'm going to pull up another of those shift right mouse button marquee menus. So in this case, we've got a bunch of commands and tools that are helpful when working in with edges. And this one over here says delete edge. So if we do that one, now you can see that there's no stray vertices. Those edges are gone and the vertices are gone, and we're left with quads. So if you want to delete an edge loop, that's how you want to do it, essentially. The other place, if we hold down spacebar to open up the hotbox, the other place that shows up is under the edit mesh menu, and then we've got delete edge / vertex. And it looks like the hotkey is Control Delete. If you select, say, these edges, and you delete the edges, you might be a little bit confused by the fact that this is turned into this kind of three-sided prism. But if you think about it, it's because it's deleting the edges and the associated vertices. So this vertex is actually getting deleted. And because that vertex is deleted, that means that these two vertices are connected by only a single edge, right? So if we go delete edge, now these vertices are connected by a single edge because we've deleted the whole corner. So that's actually expected behavior. If we were to just hit the delete key, we still have the square shape, but we've created bad geometry. These are non-planar faces, they're n-gons, and they don't represent anything you could find in reality. Because even though it looks like there's a corner here, we've deleted the edge, and so Maya doesn't even know how to draw that. So that's why it's not a good idea to just hit the delete key and leave those stray vertices. All right, deleting vertices, I don't really need to talk about, because if you delete edges properly, you won't have to delete vertices. Because when you're deleting edges, you're deleting the associated vertices with them. So there shouldn't be stray vertices anywhere. But if you do something like this and you have stray vertices, all you need to do is select the vertices, and it doesn't even matter. You can select all the vertices, and if you hit delete, it'll only delete stray vertices or redundant vertices. I don't know if stray is the right word, but basically these vertices are only being used with two edges. So if you selected, say, these vertices and hit delete, it's going to give you a warning. Some selected vertices have complex edge attachment, and it will ask you to use a different command. So just marquee selecting over these and deleting will delete the redundant vertices, and now we're back to a cleaner mesh. There is a delete vertex command, so if we shift right mouse button, delete vertex, and again that would be under the edit mesh menu, delete edge vertex. It's the same command, If we do that, it's going to delete the vertex and it's going to delete the associated edges with it. So this one was connected with 3 edges, 1, 2, 3. It's going to delete those 2. And so now we've got a really weird shape. So that's not recommended. So basically at the bottom of the at the end of the day, the bottom line is that selecting faces, hitting delete, that's perfectly acceptable. And if we're in edge mode, selecting edges and using the delete edge command. Okay, so we've talked about selecting components, deleting components. So the next thing that we would want to discuss is about adding geometry. There are many ways to add geometry, and extruding is one of the most useful. So extruding happens best when you're in face mode. So if we go into face mode and select one of the edges, or faces, my goodness. If we go into face mode and select one of the faces, we can use the shift right mouse button marking menu again and go down to extrude face. Or we can go under edit mesh, under the face subheading, and nope, sorry, it's up here. Under the component subheading, it's extrude. So both of those would work. The edit mesh menu, extrude, and the shift right mouse marking menu. Extrude. Okay, so once we've hit extrude, we get this fancy little manipulator that combines the move tool, the scale tool, and the rotate tool. If we click on the wheel here, then we get all of the axes for the rotate tool. But I'm just going to select one of the move manipulators and move up. There's also this little tool box thing which is helpful. It's relatively new, so if I hit undo and just change the thickness, we can also work with it that way. If we change the offset, that's kind of like scaling it. And we can increase the number of divisions for that extrude, which can be helpful as well. So in this case, I'm just clicking on the name and dragging left and right. This is another example of kind of a virtual slider. Or you can actually click in the box and type a number, 2 divisions or 1 division. This brings me to another useful hotkey, which is to repeat the last command, you just hit G. G on the keyboard. If I hit G, it doesn't look like anything happened, but if I click and drag up, we can see that we've got another bit of geometry that's extruded. So hitting G, move up, hit G, move up, hit G, move up. So that's a quick way. And G not only works with the obviously extruding, but most of the commands that in Maya, to just repeat them, the operation, you can hit G. So the last little option here in this extrude options box, mini options box, is keep faces together. So if I select a few faces and I hit shift right mouse button, drag down to extrude face, and I move them out and I scale them down, you can see that these faces are stuck together. If I turn keep faces together off, you can see that they're being manipulated individually, and we've got these extra faces that are in between them. So those could be, depending on the scenario, you might want either to keep the faces off and have them, like if you were creating teeth or some jaws on a surgical tool or something like that, you might want to do it that way, or keep faces together on, and it works like that. Okay, one final little note about this extrude manipulator is that if you're in an axis that's off of the world and the manipulator comes in just sort of moving perpendicular to the face, which is useful in most scenarios, but if you wanted something to move with the regular world axes, you can just click on this little toggle to the top right of the manipulator, and that'll switch the axes back into world mode. And so now you're moving them with respect to the regular world axes. And you can click on it again to move back to sort of local moving mode. So that's this little toggle up here. Okay, that's about enough of the extrude. Well, it's almost enough about the extrude. There's one sort of trick that you probably will run into, and that's an easy mistake to make, which is when you're undoing extrudes. If you hit Command Z, and I'm going to hit Command Z a few times to sort of get back, it looks like I've got to the point where my mesh has not been extruded. But that's not actually true, because if I select this face and move it, you can see that we've got these two faces on top of each other, and that's going to cause problems with the mesh. If we select one of the vertices here, you can see that there's two faces sitting in the same spot, and that's not ideal. Another way to see that, if I just turn on face centers, and I did that with the shift right mouse button down to polygon display. You probably won't need this too often, but this is just to demonstrate the point. There's something called face centers, and basically that just puts a little dot in the middle of each face. So you can see that, as you'd expect, there's a dot in each of these faces, but there's also a dot at the edge of this face, and that's a signifier that indeed there's a couple of faces on top of each other, and we've got some hidden faces there. So that's no good. You would want to keep undoing until you got back to a scenario where you don't have those there. And now there's just one face there, which is what you would want. Tool number 2 that we're going to talk about is the Insert Edge Loop tool. And this one you get to by being in object mode and shift right mouse button to the Insert Edge Loop tool. The other way to get it is under the Mesh Tools, Insert Edge Loop. Mesh Tools, Insert Edge Loop. It's a little bit confusing. The mesh Polygon modeling has a few different menu sets. There's Mesh, Edit Mesh, Mesh Tools, Mesh Display, and it can be hard to remember where they are. So it's just a bit of practice to remember where they are. Or you can use the shift right mouse button. Okay, Shift marking menu, Insert Edge Loop tool, and we automatically get dumped into edge mode. And in order to insert an edge loop, all we need to do is click on an edge, and we get a loop of edges that goes all the way around our object. This would also work if we clicked on this edge, then we get a loop all the way around this way, and we can just keep clicking and adding loops. So when we're doing our walkthrough tutorial, we'll see how this can be very useful. There are a variety of options that we're also going to look at maybe later. Okay, so I'm just going to delete all of that and going to create 2 cubes to demonstrate a couple of final things. Okay, let's say we take a look at this cube and we've got a hole in it. And you'll notice that the outside is gray and the inside is black, or it's pretty black. That's not because there's some light that's shining on the outside, although that's partially true. But what this signifies is that the normals are gray when they're facing us, and black for the back side of the faces. So if we went to Mesh Display Reverse Normals, now we can see that it's black outside and gray on the inside. And that would be a scenario that you don't want, assuming that you want to be looking at the outside of the cube. If, on the contrary, you are modeling a room and you wanted to have your camera inside the room, then you would want to have the normals facing this direction. So to reverse that again, I'm going to go Mesh Display Reverse Normals, and now we have it back how we had it originally and how we want it for this bit of the demonstration. If you don't see black on one side of the faces, that probably means you have a lighting setting turned on, and I think hopefully it's off by default. But if you look at the lighting menu in the panel here, there's two-sided lighting. And if you have two-sided lighting on, that means that light is going to interact with both sides of each face. There's the front side and the back side. And I don't like having that on, because really we should know what the back side of the face is, and we shouldn't be able to see it in our final rendered view. Does that make sense? So turning off two-sided lighting is a good way to see how your normals are behaving, and it's a good way to catch problems earlier on. So I recommend keeping that off. Okay, so we've got this box and it's got a hole in it. What if we wanted to fill that hole? Well, extrude wouldn't be a good option for that, and insert edge loop is not going to help us out. So there's another tool that we can use, and that's just simply called fill hole. So if we go into edge mode, and remember when I talked about earlier, if we double click on an edge that's on a boundary, it automatically selects the boundary edges. And I'm realizing that there's a setting that's turned off that I usually like to turn on, and that's to display the boundary edges a little bit differently. So I'm going to go into the preferences. There's this little man with a gear icon. In the preferences, I'll go under the display category polygons, and I want to turn on highlight border edges. And if I hit save, okay, so you can see that the border edges are a little bit highlighted, and that's actually a useful thing that we can work with. So I recommend turning on, under polygons, highlight border edges and turn the edge width up to about 4. So double clicking on the edge will select the continuous border edges, and then all we need to do is under mesh, the mesh menu, fill hole. And it's filled the hole. And so that's pretty straightforward. Okay, so instead of filling a hole, perhaps what I want to do is I want to connect these cubes together by bridging the gap here. Now there's a fundamental problem before I can do that. And if I open up the outliner, or I hit Command-Shift-O, you can also go to Windows Outliner, you can see that we've got two objects, pcube1 and pcube2. pcube1 and pcube2 will never interact. We'll never be able to combine their components until the objects themselves are a single object. So even if I tried to bring them close together and somehow weld the vertices together, that's not going to work if they're two objects. So I'm going to select both of them, and under Mesh, hit Combine. And now we've got a third item in the outliner called pcube3, and pcube3 represents our unified mesh. You can see that when I click on one of them, the whole group gets selected. It's not really a group, I should say. The whole object gets selected. You might notice in the outliner that we've got a couple of extra things. We still seem to have pcube1 and pcube2 hanging around. And this is another instance of construction history. So these are the old connections that are still hanging around. And we could work with those, but what's probably best is to actually get rid of those. So in order to get rid of those, we can delete the history. And these bits are kind of like a snake shedding old skin. It's kind of just hanging around, and we kind of want to get rid of it before we get confused. So if we have this object selected, we can go under the Edit menu. This Edit menu is right at the top here. Edit, delete by type, history. And that's something that we'll do frequently. Edit, delete by type, history. And if we do that, then those old transform nodes get kicked off. They're no longer around. Okay, so let's get back to these two cubes here. Rather, it's one mesh, but we want to connect them together. I gave a hint earlier, we can use the bridge tool. So the bridge tool works by connecting edges together and filling faces in the intervening space. So if I double click on one side and then I shift double click on the other side, I've got all of the relevant edges selected. And now we're going to use the shift marking menu once again. And down here, somewhere around the middle, we've got bridge. Or you can go under the, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Or we could go under Edit Mesh, Bridge, near the top. So I'll do that, and now we've got the faces in the middle, and we also have this little tool option pop up that we can modify, so I can remove the divisions here. Change the number of divisions. And that's pretty much the only option that I want to talk about right now. So that's bridging between edges. I'm going to undo that. Now, in this instance, what if instead of creating faces in the middle, what if I actually just wanted these vertices to move over here and be welded to those ones? There's a few different ways to do it, but one that I'm going to talk about right now is just using the move tool. We can move the vertex over to the other one. Well, we don't want to do that by eye. We want to do it precisely. And so we can use another type of snapping. In the previous lesson, we talked about holding X to snap to the grid. In this case, we're going to hold down V to snap to a vertex. So if we hold down V, the middle of the manipulator turns into a circle. And if we grab one of the manipulators and drag, then at a certain point, it'll snap. So I'm going to do that with the other ones. I'm going to click on a vertex. And I'm going to hold V and drag and snap. And I'm going to move around to the other side, and I'm going to click on a vertex. And this time, I'm going to hold V again, but I'm going to middle mouse click on this one. And if I middle mouse click and just drag a little bit over it, then I'm telling it that's the vertex I want to snap to, and it'll snap to that one. So I'm going to click on this vertex, hold V, and middle mouse, just jiggle my mouse over that one. And so we've got all the vertices snapped here. Now we could have done this a lot faster. I'm just going to undo and show you. We could have just selected all of them, hold V, snap, done. So that's a lot faster. You might notice that we still have what looks to be a thicker edge here, and that's signifying our border edges. And so that's telling us that the vertices aren't actually welded together. They're just sitting on top of each other. If we clicked on one of them, instead of marquee clicking or marquee dragging over them, if we just clicked on one of them, we can see that these haven't been joined at all. They're just sitting on top of each other. So in order to fix that, we can run a merge command. And so selecting all of the relevant vertices, you guessed it, shift right mouse button. And this time we're going to go up to merge vertices and then the regular. There's a few different types of merging, but we're going to just use the regular merge vertices. And then we get a pop-up with a distance threshold, and that should be absolutely fine, assuming that the vertices are perfectly lined up over each other. We can see that the highlighting has gone away, and so these vertices are definitely now they're one and the same, and we've got a nice unified mesh now. So if I wanted to do that from the regular menus, I can select the vertices, and under, I'm just going to take a guess here, under Edit Mesh, Merge. Yeah, so that's done it. And then with the regular right mouse marquee menu, I can go back into object mode, and we've got a complete object here.